Good evening and welcome everyone to the MRes Architecture RCA and Architecture Foundation event, the Architecture of Loss. My name is Adam Kaasa and I'm the program lead of the MRes Architecture program at RCA, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here tonight to talk through a set of questions that have really marked my program and my students' interests over the last 4 months, and to mark a moment of celebration in their student path. Today marks the launch of their student publication, a digital publication on the architecture of loss, which I encourage you to have a look at. I'm putting the link in the chat so you can look at that at your leisure. But some of the questions that we're going to be thinking about tonight really stem from their research, and it's the students who have invited our two guests tonight to speak. Some of the questions that we've been thinking around have been the following. How can loss be understood as a mechanism that might be distributed unequally across space? What are the uneven geographies of loss? How might it be a mechanism that is unequal across intersections of race, ability, sexuality, gender, and class? How is loss spatialized? And what are our reactions to it? How does ritual feature in the history of urban loss? What's the relationship between urban change, memory, ritual, loss, and grief? As a word of context, this project started with the students before many of us were coming into a lockdown because of COVID. And so the themes of their project really intersected with contemporary moment around the loss of the city, the loss of routine, and more recently with Black Lives Matter, questions of collective grief and publicity in the city. So we're hoping that tonight we can explore in a public way some of these thoughts, and our two guests, I think, are really apt to introduce us to some of the research that they've been doing that link to ritual, that link to questions of space and technology, that link to time and temporality, and that open up this conversation. The way we're going to work tonight is I'll introduce our two speakers. Each of them will be a program have designed, and so the conversation will be led by those student designed questions. And if there's time and if there's an interest in the chats, we can come to some of your comments and questions throughout. So do feel free to use the chat box to raise ideas or issues throughout this talk tonight. So our two speakers, as I said, are Francesca Dell'Aglio. Francesca is an architect and writer whose research considers the history of architecture in terms of the history of bodies in space. She's a tutor at the AA and also at the Royal College of Art, where she's also currently a PhD candidate in the School of Architecture. Our second speaker tonight is Ibiye Camp, and Ibiye's art practice focuses on post-colonial subjectivities, technology, the built environment, and particularly to geographies of West Africa. She's designed a fashion series called Such a Fan that's exhibited at the Victoria and Albert Museum in 2016. Her first solo show took place at Kenya, Berlin in 2017. And more recently, she contributed to the inaugural Sharjah Triennale of Architecture that launched in 2019-2020. So we're really thrilled to have Ibiye with us here as well. So without further ado, I'll hand over to our first speaker of the night, Francesca.
Thank you, Adam. I'll share my screen. So maybe just to introduce what I'm presenting today, it's somehow a kind of collateral research or collateral interest that sparked through my ongoing research. I'm in my third year of my PhD. But yeah, I would like to share with you a series of images that I think would be interesting as just to start a conversation, I think, on most of the themes, let's say, that I investigate through my research. So I'm a researcher in architecture, researcher, and not really a practicing architect. And through my research and work, I aim at bringing, let's say, a sort of conscious of our bodies in space, acknowledging it as a fundamental medium in the process of design. As most of researcher, we proceed through stages and steps, and when we get fascinated by some particular details, we focus on those extensively and sometimes even obsessively. So in this case, I'm recently very much attached and interested by the work of Leon Kossoff's, who most of you might know as a painter active in the second half of the 20th century. And his famous drawing of London are well known, but in particular, I want to focus on his sketches, which will be the starting point of my very short contributions, and which intend, let's say, to act more like as a provocation today. So the premise of my research, is that the gradual evolution of social behavior and space goes hand in hand. Bodies and architecture therefore influence each other. Architecture is a translation of bodies' behavior in space, and for such reason, the process of design depends on them. The line on a piece of paper is the immediate crystallization of the trace that a body leaves behind. This creates a blurring definition between the space and its subjects, in the same way Kossoff's work, and especially in the sketches for his sculptural paintings, show. It is hard here to distinguish where the body ends and architecture begins, which gives meaning to architecture as a direct consequence of society. The characters of Kossoff were evidently portraying a collectivity whose loss today can clearly represent the failure of architecture. Such imagery that Kossoff painted in the late 1900s is almost stranger to us today. To a society in the wake or in the midst of a pandemic crisis that imposed a prescriptive routine on us, through which society has now grown accustomed to, nurturing a feeling almost of distrust towards a collective living. I'm sure we are all familiar with those pictures published by the New York Times during the early weeks of the lockdown, when we were all fascinated by our empty cities. And this lockdown, of course, has shown to us pictures of haunted cities and architecture, empty spaces that have been considered sad premonition of a future yet to come. For the first time in a long time, architects now have been called into question on how to rethink our city after a moment of crisis, which is indeed the moment where we can revolutionize our world and look at it and maybe shape it and contribute to its life differently. Many thoughts and theory have been put forward by urbanists, architects, artists, sociologists, and so on, about the life that will radically change. But is this life changing now, or what is changing already? Has architecture lost its anthropological gaze now, or was it far lost in its recent history? So these are a series of pictures taken from Planet Earth, 21st Century, which is a book of postcards published by Humboldt Books by artist Daniela Comani, who flew over cities and buildings between 2015 and 2019. So it's far before the lockdown that we're actually facing today. So architecture images and from school to practice introduce people in the space almost as a moral duty. There will be no realism in an image without its subject, if we think about it. So a client wouldn't understand the project, a tutor would not appreciate the sensitivity of a student, and an examiner would not grasp the real scale of the project. So subjects are not an appendix that fill up the drawing, but they are, on the contrary, the real engine of this machine, the starting point of a project. Disputes and tension, frictions and frontality, the relationship between architecture and human body as always lies in this limbo. The tension between freedom of movement and the body as a political subject contrasts with the permanence of architecture as a translation of social activities. Rituals, as occasional reenactment of history, can be crystallized into habitual actions, where the meaning of place becomes flattened by the homogenization of capital. Sustained by routines and habits, the capitalized space becomes secure and familiar, and demonstrate a loss of self-identity more than a simple loss of place. So we go back to this, which is the actual famous, instead, painting. So what I'm questioning with this short provocation is whether we are capable of bringing this identity back into space, not only after this moment of crisis, but really whether we were listening to those subjects before, what we are witnessing now. Whether the process of design was contemplated human condition before, and he has not simply lost the collective ritual, but its actual subject. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Francesca. It's great to start the evening with this reminder of this kind of the evolution of social practices and the evolution of space and architecture, kind of going hand in hand, thinking about bodies as traces in space. That was a really visceral, and the kind of images that you've given us, I think, speak to that. People as a moral image in practice and in representation. But then thinking around your last question, are we capable, and what's the ethic of thinking identity in space, and thinking perhaps a renewed attention to collective ritual as a guiding co-constitution of space, or a guiding producer of space, and if not, how we might help to design or redesign moments of those collective rituals. So there's a lot on the table in that opening conversation. Thanks very much.
Stop sharing.
Ibiye, would you like to follow on?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. By the way, it was a lot of beautiful points that I hope to touch on at the end to carry on. So I should share my screen, sorry. Is that sharing? Yeah.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So I kind of thought about the question of kind of the architecture of loss and how maybe that relates to my practice. So I studied at the RCA in MA Architecture, but my background is in fine art, and I kind of see myself as a practicing artist. But I kind of thought that the inequality of loss, it's how it's distributed through race and geography, kind of relates to my project at the moment. So I'm going to kind of present 4 projects which I've developed over the past year, like between 2019 to now. So I think to describe my practice, I use mixed media, and particularly at the moment, I've been using augmented reality. And there are rules kind of in technology and algorithm, which I explore in my practice. I kind of like want to utilize the problems and the glitches and the biases which come from technology. And what I find interesting is that glitches could be described as a loss of information and a sudden kind of unusual temporary malfunction or fault in equipment. So I tend to use photogrammetry at the moment, which is a kind of process which uses photographs that measure distance and space to make 3D forms. So there's also a lot of conflicts with objects which are black or have reflective surfaces, or shots with moving backgrounds. They tend to be disjointed or kind of come up as incorrect, I say, with kind of, in photogrammetry. So the 3D forms that I've created, I see kind of that they challenge architectural representations and technology for like pristine Western environments. So the first project I want to present was when I was studying at the RCA. I was in a studio which was ADS8, data matter, digital networks and post-human institutions. I was exploring data centers and the presence of data in the landscape of Nigeria and Sierra Leone. And I'll start off by describing how a century ago, the most valuable resource was oil, but today it's data. Crude oil was deemed as Nigeria's black gold in 1956. Multinational corporations laid bare unprotected oil pipelines across the landscape of the Niger Delta. The production of oil has led to spills and explosions that have contaminated the land, rivers, and exploited citizens. This is a way of controlling the landscape and people's livelihoods. Today, there is a digital revolution in Lagos. So I was exploring a data center called Main One. To the right of the screen, this is showing how Main One actually had a malfunction where they leaked customers' Google what's it called, the Cloudflare IP routes to a Chinese telecom company, and the companies declared this as an ugly mistake. And even though the company is known for corporate surveillance and recent cases of traffic diversion. So with my projects, I kind of wanted to compare the kind of unevenness of the leaks, whether it was with data or with technology and with oil, between kind of governments, private corporations, citizens. So my stance in the project, I wanted to aim to explore how data could be utilized to give restitutions to citizens during a time of technological investments from overseas corporations. So I developed kind of informal devices that could be connected to Android or kind of phone, which there's a lot of in West Africa at the moment. And I wanted to see how people could collect their own data, because maybe one day data will become something that we will trade with or sell ourselves. So I created these devices, and then from that, they created these 3D models, and the models are slightly glitched as I developed them on a low render, because again, these technologies use an immense amount of electricity, and in spaces where you can't have access to electricity, so I wanted to kind of render them on a lower setting. So the glitches and voids kind of illustrate this tension of technology again in this film. And in presenting the project as well, I wanted to show this layering and spaces between the historic kind of oil past to the present day of data and technological use within West Africa. And these are kind of 3D forms, which I then re-photographed, where I collected the data and then revisited. So that's the first project. The second project is from the assembly of the extra rail, which was a project which I did with Malik Mohammed and Marina Otero, and it was a conversation kind of about rethinking the Berlin conference. So we kind of sat around this table and we were talking about past politics of migration, and we wanted to rethink the Berlin conference. We called it the Berlin conference as a remix, and so we kind of manipulated the interiors in the space, and we together as a group, we had these figures and we replaced the heads with these androids, where we would put the maps on the table were used as target images, so that we could use it to maybe show other type of Afro-surrealism, of maybe speculate what would have been if Africa hadn't been colonized. And also we kind of were melting monuments, and this kind of idea of manipulating the existing. We did this also with the interiors of the space, so there were tiles around the room, which we use augmented reality to kind of manipulate with a kente and different types of fabric. My third project, which I want to speak about, which at the end of 2019, I was commissioned by the Sharjah Architecture Triennale to look into the sacred forests of Ethiopia. And I'll describe how there are thousands of sacred forests in the Anhama region in Ethiopia, and they're enclaves of religious practice and ecological intensity in the context of the rising pressure of intensive farming and deforestation. So this is a photograph which I took when I was flying over the Anhama region. So you can distinctly see how there is monasteries with immense amounts of forest around them, and then very organized kind of farming with the villages around. And so for this project, I created an installation along with Emily Batterach and David Killingsworth, where we kind of deconstructed the landscape from the monastery to the forest, to the farmland, to the villages. And I created 3D scans of each point. And you can see that the moments that were inside the forest and the monasteries are more kind of organic shells and hidden spaces. They almost are like kind of resisted the scanning of the material, because again, these kind of technologies aren't designed to like maybe pick up thin kind of leaves or large intensive trees, so they create really quite interesting shapes. But as you came out of the spaces, the farmlands and the villages were kind of maybe a bit more readable, but again, I still kind of used it in this kind of quite informal way. And this is sounds which Ellie made of the space. And so as you walked through, it was like a deconstruction of the landscape. So the further you got into the centre of the exhibition, the closer you got to the monastery and the kind of more organic shapes that were more like shells and closed off. The final project that I want to show is something that I started doing through kind of lockdown. So these are previous videos I've taken of East Street Market, where every day the shopkeepers set up shop, kind of dragging their market stalls back and forth. I've always found that very fascinating with my work, kind of London and the way that like people have formed kind of streets rather than kind of architecture. It's kind of like urban architecture of how people like kind of bind the city and their practice. So this again is a photogrammetry, which I love, but then I reuse the photogrammetry again this year to try and reimagine what the streets will be like once lockdown is lifted, how we're going to have maybe barriers or spaces, and what does this data that I took in 2019 mean for rethinking the city today. And again, kind of placing augmented reality in the spaces of the street. Here, kind of trying to put back what was there before. Yeah, so that's all of my work.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Ibiye. There's a lot in the 4 projects you showed. Definitely, I mean, certainly a lot around technology to bring things to make things present, but also the inability of technology to capture at times what's present. So the bias is embedded in terms of what can be captured. Certainly in that last one, kind of putting back what's lost, but this kind of mistranslation of it through the glitches or the lack in that technological space. And certainly, you know, oil spills is both loss but then presence. You know, a spill is a loss from the pipeline, but then a presence in the environment. So this kind of notion of presence and absence that comes with some of the losses you're talking about, the data leaks, equally, and some really compelling. Really compelling to see the kind of use of form as a way to try to, again, make visible these glitches, these losses, these lacks in a way. I wanted to maybe start by asking each of you if there seems to be a correlate in both your talks. There's something Francesca raises about kind of social behavior or people, bodies literally in space as kind of co-constitutive of spaces themselves. And Ibiye, there's something in yours around, or you're centering in your artwork on kind of data as a constitutive element of space and spatial form. So you have kind of data and people, and I know sometimes the two are one and the same. But I wonder if each of you could think about, are you thinking of them you know, analogically? Is the body for Francesca, data for Ibiye? Do you see them both as kind of products of and productive of space?
I was well, if I start, like I think that while Ibiye was talking about the user, the way she uses data, I think it's quite fascinating, because somehow data, I see them more as traces. Traces that they have a sort of like double, they could have a double meaning, right? Like, because they could be very bad somehow. We can reject data, we can be very doubtful about data, but also they are indeed the traces. They can definitely represent traces of specific movements and mapping. So somehow I see that kind of parallel in that on that level. So this idea of really like how do we translate a specific body in space, and then is an alternative way of translation somehow, which I think is quite potentially very fascinating. What I like about, for example, what you do, Ibiye, is that there is an optimism in the way we could use this, and then it's not just a negative aspect, right? Like it's not just a negative translation, I think, which is quite interesting. And the other thing is this idea of manipulation, which both bodies and data can be easily manipulated, right? Like for different purpose and different ends, which I think is also another kind of point of encounter, and I think of discussion too.
Yeah, I think what I was quite fascinated with the comment that you made as well, especially with what you showed with the kind of expressive drawing, the hand strokes, this type of trying to kind of like reimagine what a space would be like, and that kind of fluidity and movement and paint strokes and kind of charcoal movements and things like that. And in a way, I found those kind of sketches really provocative in the way that, like, I kind of see as well with the absence of space with the photogrammetry. It's kind of like an abstract, it's like a suggestion of bodies and movement, and that's what with the photogrammetry models that I form in like a really kind of quite messy way, it tries to emulate that kind of absence of not absence, but presence of busyness and people as well. So I feel like data and bodies are kind of, I like to think that it's treated this similarly, and I agree that I try to be optimistic with this idea of data centers and the abundance of kind of data and people, and obviously there are moments where it's used in a terrible way, but there's also maybe there's a restitution in the way that people, if citizens start kind of using it in a really exciting way too, or yeah.
One of the you're making me think of one of the questions that the students put forward, which was thinking around in kind of both of the cases that you're working and some of the more emergent projects Ibiye more recently. Is there something around, so talking about bodies and data, is there something around the materiality also of urban space? So thinking around in particular the difference between a more homogeneous or a more heterogeneous kind of urban materiality. So is there something around the behavior that produces space, or the spaces that produce behavior, that starts to become restricted as materials, as forms, as typologies circulate in kind of globally efficient modes? And maybe then how does that, in your work, Ibiye, how do traces kind of form against something that presents perhaps a kind of material resistance to kind of difference or appropriation?
Yeah, so I don't know if I really like understood the question that well, but like in terms of materiality of urban space, like I would kind of pick the busiest areas to work in order to like kind of disrupt the photogrammetry process. And in like, or not in order, it was kind of a process that happened naturally. But then after I realized that fast moving kind of figures create this kind of distorted form, is something that I ended up building like a kind of digital city of this, and like showing how I was talking to my mother before about kind of loss of kind of black space or something, and meaning that sometimes technology or systems that are designed not for the space that is other, if that makes sense, other than a pristine Western environment or something. And so definitely kind of, I don't know, sometimes I get uncomfortable with the word urban as well, because I'm like, oh, I definitely have like used it like kind of in odd ways before. But in terms of the scans I did of Lagos markets and then East Street Market, they're definitely informal areas that aren't kind of photogrammetry friendly, but then that kind of resistance then creates a project in itself, which is critical of tools that are in use for understanding space, because it doesn't quite grasp these particular spaces.
Mm-hmm.
There is also, I don't know, another thing that I find quite interesting, and probably is also another kind of level of encounter between the two works, is just, I'm really fascinated by this idea of the glitches as an interruption, and as you call it, as a malfunction, because somehow also sits quite beautifully in this idea of datas, as you said, like also Adam, drives to, it can be used efficiently, like kind of evoke this idea of efficiency and then quite clear directionality, this use of prediction of a data. But the beauty of a glitch is, of course, that is unpredictable, and then you don't know exactly where you can place it. And it is exactly somehow what, like, my research really like sits in this sort of dispute between ritual and habitual action, and somehow it quite like it clarifies this idea, what to me is the major difference between the two, which is the unpredictability. Because of course the habitual action is something that is unconscious, can be easily performed without even too much thinking. A ritual instead could have, or at least has an origin of consciousness, let's say, at some point. Then of course it falls into some rules and regulations, and then it just gets repeated, and that's quite what kind of leads that to an habitual action. But the glitch is something also that has a very small time frame, is a very short time frame that it's hard to map. And what I did, this idea, instead of focusing exactly on that kind of unpredictability, it's something that can really also make us look at the space quite differently. The urban space, or like any kind of the space where the body sits, let's say, quite differently, and give a different interpretation to that kind of body, and kind of ties to that conversation that we were having today on this idea of representing and translating specific movements.
Mm.
Yeah.
Is there something in, that's really interesting, is there something in in the form of kind of habitual and ritual modes of behavior in space, let's say, that the glitch is the glitch something other, or is it simply a kind of interruption kind of between those two? And what I think is really interesting about your work, Ibiye, is that the glitch is a kind of accident, but then you realize that the glitch is actually embedded, right? It's embedded in the way in which this technology works, or refuses to work against certain colors, certain modes, certain textures, certain materials. So it's actually, we understand it as a glitch only insofar as there's a norm that works or functions. There's a habit, there's a habitual. But actually the glitch is itself, not simply an accident or a surprise. It's a kind of embedded, it's an embedded part, or an embedded inequality, possibly. Yeah.
Yeah, I think when it comes to kind of certain objects where the color or the texture kind of isn't kind of picked up, I feel as though I call it a glitch, and but now it's something become like almost purposeful, and it kind of brings me back to thinking of purposeful leaks that happened in the Niger Delta as a way to like kind of control the landscape. And I feel like kind of purposeful glitches almost could be like a way of controlling society. And I think, I don't know if it's kind of too off topic, but obviously there's kind of facial recognition where people of color are kind of constantly being misidentified with surveillance and stuff. So that's like a kind of not habitual maybe, but something that has been there for a long time with facial recognition, but still today we still have that problem with this certain type of technology. And I also feel like there's so much kind of power in kind of, and resistance in not being recognized as well. Obviously there's been misidentified, but then also been not some filters on Instagram and all sorts won't pick up your face if you're not kind of lit. And I think there's so much kind of power in kind of absence as well. Yeah.
I mean, that leads me to another question that the students have generated, because up until relatively recently, a lot of urban public spaces have been marked by absence. And Francesca, you showed us the series of images, which also kind of aestheticize that absence in particular ways. And we know that cities are full of absence and presence, you know, and always have been. But I wonder, the question reads like this, and it's really about possibly thinking forward. So they ask, given what we know about the relationship of rituals, habits, and the production and use of space, and thinking what's occurring now in relation to the space of the pandemic, how do you think, or do you think, our relationship to urban space will change? So become prophets for a minute.
Yeah, exactly. Wait a second, just put on my glasses.
We won't hold it up to you in the months to come.
Yeah. I don't.
Is there an opportunity? I mean, or is there a possibility of a shift or change?
I think I don't know. I think while in preparing this sort of sequence of image for today, I think that there is a moment in which I say, like, of course, a moment of crisis is a good moment to also start thinking differently. And what I find quite interesting, although of course it brings to a sort of a sequence of different vision on the future, is that architects have been called into question once again, which is quite unprecedented. And it is either for an interior, for a domestic space, or for the way we design our cities, but it's been quite a long time since we didn't have those discussions publicly, rather than have them only interiorly amongst us. So like in academia or within a practice. So I think that that's somehow a promising, of course, thing. If I would have to make a prediction, it's not bad. Of course, it depends on where those conversation is going to lead to, also because the big issues also will be acting without really much thinking, which has been also how cities somehow have been designed, let's say today. But that would be probably an interesting point where that can open discussion, let's say, in which I could envision, let's say, interesting discussion about the way we leave the space, and the way maybe the sort of like multitude of platform of conversation and the multitude of subjects that having this conversation. So the fact that architect really confronts themselves with also people could be, and subjects and inhabitants, and also put on their head not just as designer but also as citizens. That could be probably an interesting, let's say, path. Of course, it's hard to predict, but what I'm realizing recently is that there are more and more discussions, which of course could be definitely speculation and can be definitely labeled as speculations, but at least could be a good and interesting starting point. I don't know if that answered the questions, but yeah.
Great. Ibiye, what do you think?
Gosh, I'm not quite sure if I got the question completely. What, can you repeat it for me, please?
Basically, yeah. I mean, given the way urban space has kind of been made absent, it's been kind of emptied over the past months. Yeah. Do you think there's going to be a new relationship to space? Do you think space matters more?
Yeah, I think. Well, I feel like that our answers have kind of been, our questions have kind of been answered, because, well, I was looking at East Street Market, and it's really interesting because it started like the market's back. Right. Yeah, and so I've actually, I feel like I was more like pessimistic because it's back and running, and I thought that there would be like kind of more of a structure and formula to the space, and I kind of was upset, well, not upset, but kind of worried that it would lose the kind of the way that citizens, like people of East Street, have kind of built and built up the formulas of the market, whereas actually they still maintain that formula, whereas it doesn't have barriers. And the way that I kind of was thinking, or at the beginning of lockdown, with the kind of really shocking imagery of like everything 2 meters apart, and everything seems quite kind of our futures seemed a bit cold. It's actually still got its own kind of rituals and forms at the moment, and that's one thing I just see as an observer.
That's great. I mean, it is interesting that these conversations we've been having for the last number of months are kind of presently being answered, like you say, in real time, and I guess it's interesting to pay attention to those things as you are doing with the market in some of your work. One of the other questions that the students wanted to raise was thinking, in both of your work, there's a consideration of kind of the practices and emergences of, call it urban life, although Ibiye, you said, what is urban? Collective life maybe is another phrase we could think about. Do you think there's does loss figure as a central relationship in collective life? And in your work, does it figure, or is it something that that is simply another frame of reference in terms of your thinking, either Francesca on ritual, habit, the social production of space, or Ibiye in terms of data, in terms of malfunctions, in terms of glitches, in terms of kind of misrepresentations? Do you see it for you as loss a concept that lands or works or productive?
I think in terms of my practice, I feel like there's like a power in loss, and kind of resilience or something, which I quite enjoy, but also there's a critique of my subjects tend to be like quite post-colonial subjects of kind of exchanges with West Africa, and kind of the connections to Europe. So I guess there's a sense of loss in that as well, which again, maybe will be one day like more of like a kind of restitution of some sort that will come from that loss of being colonized. Yeah.
If I would have to, I see that could definitely maybe be there, in the sense that it could be a positive, it could have a positive impact on at least the way I'm reading the production of space and collective space, because as we said before, like loss can produce a practice, and this idea, for example, of losing something and reappropriating about something as a sort of that envision an ideal, an hypothetical loss, is somehow brings a sort of surprise. I think someone mentioned this afternoon, a surprise in the everyday, which is something exactly where I see that sort of thin line between ritual and habit, which is again something that is unpredictable and unprecedented, and an interruption, again, that idea of glitch, that idea also presented at the beginning. So if seen in that way, I can definitely envision it in the work, and then and I think so, yes, look at it like as a practice, as a process. Yes.
Yeah, I wrote down from I can't remember who said it, but someone was like, kind of something you never had and kind of designing from that. Like there were so many beautiful kind of like phrases and kind of sentences said earlier.
Just for everyone who's joining us tonight, we held a kind of 4-hour symposium on the architecture of loss just previously. But it was a kind of closed session of participants. So that's where some of these thoughts or ideas are coming from. Yeah, I think Ibiye, the note you're thinking of is the trying to remember something you never had access to or didn't have access to. Our students use the Tilt Crow.
There was also this idea, I think, of repurposing and like this idea of function, for example. In fact, if something is lost and lost the meaning, has lost the function, of course, this idea of reappropriation, of repracticing something new in that space and in that space, let's say, it can definitely be like a propositional way of looking at that loss, let's say. And so this idea of repurposing a space, I think, is quite also interesting and giving it a new function. Sorry, the dog.
That's all right. Well, we've got about 10, 12 minutes left, and I wondered, I do see some of the faces from the MRes students here in the audience, and I've been given some questions from you, but I'm wondering if there are any questions you'd now like to ask of our speakers or thoughts that are coming up from the conversation that's emerging that you wanted to pose. So I'll invite any of the students from the MRes program who are here tonight, if you'd like to contribute to the conversation or ask another question.
Adam, if they want to contribute, they just need to let me know their name. I can unmute them.
Oh, great.
Just let me know who.
So give us a wave if you'd like to say something, and we can unmute you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for presenting today. I was wondering, because I've seen the project that Ibiye made, that you presented for the Design Museum, and I've read what Francesca's PhD proposal is, and I was wondering, because you're dealing with loss and maybe the future that it is connected to loss, how the situation and how what has happened to like the current situation, how this can influence the way that you're dealing with loss and how this maybe inform your research. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Eleonora. Are there any others who want to add a question at the moment, or we come to Ibiye? Okay, Ibiye.
Yeah, so in terms of kind of loss with my practice and kind of looking into the future with it, I think that there's another sentence that was said earlier that we were thinking about monuments and how when there's a monument there, you don't really kind of think about it, but then when it's taken away, those are the monuments that you remember and stuff. And I feel like with moving forward, kind of the changing and disruption of loss and when things are kind of changed in your collective spaces, that's when kind of not progression, but kind of new kind of ideologies are kind of made, I think. And with my practice, I think I tend to utilize that kind of loss or malfunction as a way to kind of continue to talk about kind of the future or of how we practice in our mediums. And it's not always obviously something that happens. I think there are particular moments like right now when with our political kind of movements and also COVID-19, that is a moment where there is a lot of chopping and changing, and I feel like there's such a power in loss and absence, basically, and changing of our collective spaces. So I think I tend to really try and utilize that, and I don't really know what is going to happen with my documentation of East Street Market, but again, I think that observing of loss, yes, it's such a power, basically. Yeah.
I mean, building on from that, Francesca, do you think architects or spatial designers have a problem with loss, a problem with leaving things empty, or a problem with lack? Is there something embedded within the disciplines themselves where loss figures as a threat rather than as something possibly productive?
Well, I'm not sure I can really answer that, but like, or at least it's a very subjective idea. But I think that the images about like the use of bodies, for example, in the images is quite telling on this note, because it's quite rare that we can explain an architecture without the body within it, although again the body becomes just a decorative element. On the other hand, of course, they are quite fascinating, like empty architectures, let's say. And then if we think about a lot of photography of architecture, for example, in history, has been a lot of building have been reproduced without people. So if we think about the body and the loss and the absence, as the loss as an absence of the subject and the body, there is a sort of very weird, I think, position. It is, I don't really know, because I think we get fascinated by an empty space, but at the same time, we don't want it to be empty. So it's quite hard, I think, and there is a different gap between what is represented and what is actually then eventually realized. So sometimes it's quite strange where we see like representation full of people, but then eventually we go and see the place and it's totally empty and there are no people in the place. So it doesn't answer at all the question, but like probably is because I don't know. But I think that in my research, I'm somehow, it's a provocation again, and it's a provocation about the way we deal with this loss, and the way, in fact, we don't face the fact that this loss exists, because we just cover it by filling up the space with bodies without real conscience of what these bodies mean in the space.
I mean, that makes me think of maybe a kind of, I mean, we're coming to a close of time, and without kind of pressing on too many more issues, but I wondered, I mean, one of the words we haven't spoken of too much so far, though it features in the kind of guiding questions, is the concept of grief. And one of the original thoughts around kind of architecture and loss is that the city is a churn of change, and that change impacts and hits on different bodies in different ways. Some people have smooth rides and don't experience or can weather change. Others face the provocation of change on a daily basis, or the threat of change. So this unequal relationship to loss, and therefore something like and again, each of you can say, I don't know how to answer it, but you know, is the city the right space to grieve? Is the city now a place where we can collectively grieve?
It should be.
It should be.
I think. I don't know. What do you think, Ibiye?
Yeah, I feel like it is. I feel like obviously there's so many kind of. I feel like as a city, we grieve together quite often, I think. So it definitely is that, and I feel like the idea of collectivity and community, we have to as well. I feel like, you know, we're kind of constantly like checking on our neighbours, particularly at the moment as well. So I think we do grieve within the city, and I think it is the place.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think maybe that's the way to bring us to the end of a discussion. It certainly made me think a lot about kind of looking at different political movements of protest and bodies in space as, you know, in Francesca's words, kind of social practices and bodies kind of constituting space and marking space in different ways, also as spaces of collective grief. And possibly also the note from Ibiye, just thinking again how we mark and measure what we see and don't see, and those visible and invisibilities of traces of data, of bodies, of materials in the city, and that loss isn't always present because we might have an absence to recognize it. So a lot of the conversation that you've been bringing is really helpful in thinking through this relation. We just had a comment from one of the people here asking around grief about lost spaces and sites due to gentrification. I think that's, you know, in the previous comments, that's really part of that notion of the uneven churn of change in the city and how that benefits some and disproportionately affects others. So yeah, a really, really great comment from that participant about gentrification, change, and grief. So it leaves me to thank you, Francesca, and you, Ibiye, for your time today, for your presentations and conversations. I want to thank the organizers, the Architecture Foundation, but most especially the students from the MRes Architecture program, Eleonora Antoniadu, Mathilde Crow, Ziad Al-Nusayan, Blanca Aragones, Union Guo, and Joanna Laloska for their research and their time into this project. And once more, do check out the launch of their digital publication, which is online through the link in the chat. Thank you all very much for joining us, and enjoy your evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.